OpenStax Biology, 2nd edition, Chapter 1, The Study of Life. Let's go. Here's what's coming your way in Chapter 1. Section 1 is the science of biology. Section 2 is themes and concepts of biology. And we're just going to cover Section 1 in this video. Section 2 will be a separate video. And before we get started, I want to point out, this lecture is designed to be comprehensive and thorough, but it's also supposed to be supplementary to the textbook. I assume most people watching this are watching it for a class, so you're probably reading the textbook anyway, but I just wanted to point that out. All right, Section 1, the science of biology. So what is the science of biology? In broad terms, it means the study of life. But the word life in and of itself is pretty broad. It can mean a lot of different things, which is why we have a lot of different branches of biology. For instance, you have microbiology, study of microorganisms, genetics, the study of genes and gene expression. Then you also have ecology, the study of interactions of living organisms along with their environment. And then bioinformatics, which is pretty interesting actually, where you use computational tools and approaches to analyze and interpret biological data. So we know biology is a science, but what is a science? The word science comes from the Latin for knowledge. The textbook defines science as knowledge that covers general truths or the operation of general laws, especially when acquired and tested by the scientific method. Now, this definition is a little bit self-referential because it uses scientific method to define science. But essentially what they're trying to get across to you is that science is a systematic study of the world through experimentation. Now on to hypotheses and theories. Now you've probably heard a hypothesis defined as an educated guess. That's an okay definition, but the textbook here offers something a little more sophisticated. It defines hypothesis as a suggested explanation for an event which one can test. And that last part, which one can test, is the really important thing to pay attention to here. In order for a hypothesis to be considered valid, it has to be testable. Like if I said Tyrannosaurus Rex had psychic powers, that's a terrible hypothesis for a number of reasons, but primarily because you can't test that. But if I said Tyrannosaurus Rex had a highly sophisticated sense of smell, that's a much better hypothesis. That's something we can actually start to test. Moving on to theories. Now, the concept of a scientific theory is often misunderstood because we use the word theory in everyday language. But pay attention to the textbook's definition of theory here. It's a tested and confirmed explanation for observations or phenomena. Now, this is not like when I say I have a theory when I'm talking about Area 51. Scientific theories are backed up by large bodies of evidence. And you might wonder, okay, if theories are confirmed explanations and they're backed up by so much evidence, why do we call them theories? Why don't we call them something like a law? That's because scientific laws and scientific theories describe very different things. They are fundamentally different concepts. Scientific laws are predictive, while scientific theories are explanatory. Like for instance, Newton's second law of motion, force equals mass times acceleration. This law says that if you know the mass and the acceleration, you can predict the amount of force. Now, the theory of evolution by natural selection, it doesn't predict anything. Evolution is caused by random mutations. There's no way to predict random mutations. What the theory of evolution by natural selection does is it explains how life changes over time. We've observed that life changes over time. The theory of evolution by natural selection explains how that happens. So scientific laws predict outcomes. Scientific theories explain observations. And also we use the term theory because it allows for refinement. As new information comes in, we can refine a theory. So now that we've talked about hypotheses and theories, the textbook offers another definition of science, which is fields of study that attempt to comprehend the nature of the universe. And hypotheses and theories are tools that we use to do that. And on the right side of the screen, you can see a picture of Sir Francis Bacon. Most historians credit old Frank Bacon here as the person who first defined the scientific method. And notably, he relied primarily on inductive methods. And we're going to talk more about inductive and deductive reasoning a little bit later in this section. But he believed that true knowledge was derived from sensory experience and through observation. So he thought that inductive reasoning should be the cornerstone of the scientific method. Now, biology is considered a natural science. You might also sometimes hear the term hard science. Hard science is usually used because the science you're describing is mostly associated with quantitative data, unlike social sciences, which often use qualitative data. Like you can count atoms and bacteria, so that's quantifiable, but you can't count anxiety, not like directly. You can ask a subject, hey, what is your anxiety level on a scale of 1 to 10? But that's still qualitative and it's still self-reporting. It's more subjective than, say, counting the number of bacteria. So it makes it a little harder to standardize. So that's what hard science means. The textbook defines natural science as fields of science related to the physical world and its phenomena and processes. So we're talking about biology, computer science, geology, logic, physics, chemistry, mathematics, and astronomy. And we can further categorize natural sciences actually. We can break them down into life sciences and physical sciences. So life sciences, like biology, study living things. The physical sciences study non-living things. Now it's time to talk about the scientific method. So the textbook defines the scientific method as a method of research with defined steps that include experiments and careful observation. The book also points out that the scientific method is easily applied to things like biology, chemistry, and physics. But it can be more difficult to apply the scientific method to things like archaeology, psychology, and geology. This is primarily because their experiments aren't as easily repeatable. Now, these disciplines are still sciences, don't get it twisted, but like psychology, for example, you're usually dealing with the invisible. Thoughts, emotions, behaviors, things you can't always directly measure or observe. The variables involved can't be tightly controlled. Like maybe the subject didn't sleep well the night before a study. That's going to affect their thoughts, their emotions, and their behavior. It's going to be different from how they would normally behave and think and feel. So how do you control that? So let's run through this flowchart that the textbook gives to kind of get a feel for how the scientific method works. Normally, you're going to start by making some sort of an observation. Like, I tried to use the remote to turn on my television and it didn't work. So that's the observation. Then you're going to ask a question. Why won't my TV turn on when I try to use the remote control? Based on your question, then you're going to form a hypothesis that attempts to answer that question. So an example of a hypothesis might be, the batteries in the remote are dead. So then, after you've developed some sort of hypothesis that is testable, you're going to make a prediction based on that hypothesis. It's going to sound something like, if this, then that. So you might make a prediction like, if the batteries in the remote are dead, then replacing them will allow me to turn the TV on. So then you're going to do an experiment. You're going to test that hypothesis and see if your prediction was correct. You'll actually change the batteries in the remote control. Then you're going to analyze the results. If the TV turns on, your hypothesis is supported. If the TV does not turn on, your hypothesis is rejected or not supported, and you'll try something else. Go back and try a different hypothesis. In either case, whether your hypothesis is supported or rejected, you're going to report your results. You got to write down what happened and what you did. To paraphrase Adam Savage from Mythbusters, the difference between screwing around and science is writing it down. You got to write it down. Okay, proposing and testing a hypothesis. Proposing a hypothesis includes suggesting a testable explanation of some sort of an event. And you can suggest multiple hypotheses. Like going back to the TV analogy, maybe it is the remote batteries, but maybe the power cord came unplugged, or maybe the TV itself is broken. So just right there, you have 3 hypotheses that you can test. And like we mentioned a moment ago, you're going to make a prediction. If this, then that. If I plug the TV into a different outlet and the TV turns on, then the original outlet was the problem. So once you've proposed a hypothesis, you're going to want to test it. And of course, your hypothesis needs to be testable, but it also needs to be falsifiable. That means that if your hypothesis is wrong, whatever test you're running has to be able to show that. So the outlet is broken is falsifiable, because if I plug the TV into multiple outlets and it still doesn't turn on, then that disproves the hypothesis that the outlet was the problem. It's falsifiable. And when you're testing a hypothesis, you're not setting out to prove anything. You're setting out to understand the situation. And your understanding can be modified as new information comes in. So as the information is updated, so is our scientific understanding of whatever event we're talking about. And experimentation is a huge part of science, because what experimentation does is it eliminates one or more of your hypotheses. That way you can really start to narrow down what's going on. And any good experiment has variables and controls. Variables are things that change. Controls are things that stay constant. So plugging the same TV into different outlets, the TV in this case is your control. It's the same TV getting plugged into different outlets. The outlets are going to change every time. So the outlets are the variable in this case. Now, scientists rely very heavily on logical thinking. And there are two main types of logical thinking that we use: inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning. Now, inductive reasoning is a form of logical thinking that uses related observations to arrive at general conclusions. So you're using patterns, relationships, and trends to come to a general conclusion about something. Like, every dog that I've ever met barks. Therefore, all dogs bark. So I've used some patterns and relationships and trends that I've noticed to come to a general conclusion about dogs. That's inductive reasoning. And inductive reasoning is usually found in descriptive or discovery science. This is where you're just kind of observing, exploring, and discovering new things. It's like, ooh, that's weird. Let's figure out what's going on with that. And this kind of research can involve quantitative data or qualitative data. So mainly your goal is to make observations and record them, like see what's going on and write it down. So let's move on to deductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning is a form of logical thinking that uses general principle or law to forecast specific results. The word forecast is very important here. Deductive reasoning is predictive. So from our inductive reasoning, we decided that all dogs bark, generally speaking. So if we apply deductive reasoning here, we might say that since all dogs bark, my neighbor's new dog will bark. So we used inductive reasoning to draw a logical general conclusion, and then we used deductive reasoning to make a prediction based on that general conclusion. So you obviously need to understand what inductive and deductive reasoning are, and you need to understand the differences between them. But once you get that, the real big picture to understand here is that scientists use a combination of inductive and deductive reasoning to do research. There's almost always a little bit of both going on. And deductive reasoning you're normally going to find in hypothesis-based science. So while descriptive science describes phenomena, hypothesis-based science really works to explain how and why that phenomena occur. In hypothesis-based science, you begin with a question or a problem along with a potential answer or solution, and those answers and solutions need to be testable, of course. And like we mentioned, deductive reasoning allows you to extrapolate and predict things, so long as, and this is important to consider, you can make these predictions so long as the general principles that you're basing this prediction on are valid. So because we understand the general principle that plants need sunlight to grow, that's a valid general principle. We know that. So because it's a valid general principle, we can predict that if I put a plant in a dark closet, it's not going to grow well. This is a figure from the textbook that compares inductive and deductive reasoning. And feel free to, pause it and look through it if you're still having trouble understanding, or, go to the textbook and read more. But to put it in a way that might help anybody who's still having trouble understanding, deductive and inductive reasoning, they're kind of inverses of one another. So inductive reasoning makes specific observations and then draws general conclusions. Deductive reasoning uses general principles to make specific predictions. So hopefully that helps clear up any confusion that might still be going on. Now, the textbook also talks about two major types of science or scientific research. You have basic science, also known as pure science, and then applied science. Now, basic science seeks to expand knowledge regardless of any short-term applications that may come about. This is knowledge for the sake of knowledge. So the type of science being done in basic science or pure science, there may or may not be some sort of practical application for it, like some sort of product or a service. There may not be. That's not really the goal here. And because of that, some people view this type of science as basically useless. Like, what's the point of doing this? Well, think about it this way. Because Michael Faraday started messing around with electromagnetism back in the 1820s and 1830s, we can get electricity to our homes. We have power grids because he was just messing around. Eventually, what he was messing around with got applied to make power grids. And I don't know if he actually said this, but there's a quote that's often attributed to him within the context of somebody asking him, like, hey, what's the point of basic or pure science? Why are you messing around with electromagnetism? And he's reported to have said, of what use is a newborn baby? To basically say, like, you don't know what this baby's going to do. You need to let the baby grow up and then you'll see what's going to happen. But let's just relax. This could be useful, all right? So moving on to applied science. Applied science aims to use science to solve real-world problems. So whatever is being discovered in basic science, applied science is going to try and find a way to use that knowledge, preferably in a way that benefits us. And applied science makes it possible to improve crop yield, find cures for diseases, and solve crimes. But the textbook points out that a lot of basic research went into understanding DNA and DNA replication. And so now that knowledge is being used to identify genetic diseases, identify people that were at crime scenes, and used in paternity tests. Also, don't discount serendipity or good fortune or a happy accident, whatever you want to call it. Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin by just leaving a petri dish out overnight, accidentally uncovered. Some mystery mold started to grow on the dish and it ended up killing the bacteria that he was working with. And it turned out this was penicillin, an antibiotic. So serendipity led to the initial observation, but what's important to understand here is that Fleming still had to investigate what was going on in order for this to actually be a scientific breakthrough. You have to actually do the work. All right, so we mentioned briefly about reporting scientific findings, but you got to share your work. You got to share what you did with other scientists. And there are a bunch of different ways you can do that. You can go to scientific meetings and conferences. Those are totally valid places to share your work. But the problem is you're limited to whoever is there in person. So you don't reach nearly as many people. So what most scientists do is they end up publishing their papers as peer-reviewed manuscripts. So you write a paper based on your research, you send it in to be reviewed by a bunch of your peers and your colleagues. So biology papers are reviewed by other biologists, physics papers are reviewed by other physicists, and so on. And peer review ensures that there's no funny business going on. All the research and everything you wrote down is completely original. You're not ripping anybody off. And make sure that all the conclusions that the research team came to are actually logical, reasonable conclusions based on what they did and what they found. They make sure that the research is actually significant in some way. And they make sure that the research was sufficiently thorough. Like, yeah, you did all you could have done to answer your question. Scientific papers have different sections that you need to know about. First of all, most papers are going to have an abstract. And this is going to come first at the very top of the paper. So like the title, who wrote it, and then your abstract. This is going to be a concise summary of the whole rest of the paper. Everything else that's after the abstract, this is basically all that squished down into one paragraph. It includes like what you did, why you did it, how you did it, and what your results were, and what your interpretation is. That is everything squished together. And this will come before the introduction, which is the next section. And the introduction really provides a lot of background information. That's one of the main things the introduction does. It lets the reader know what's already known in this field of study. It should also include their research question or hypothesis, whichever, along with a rationale. Here's what we think is going to happen, and here's why we think it's reasonable to think that. This section will also include citations because it's going to be referencing other research. So to avoid plagiarism, they're going to cite these sources, and those resources will also come in the references at the end of the paper. But you always want to avoid plagiarism, so you want to make sure you cite whatever references you're using. Then you get to materials and methods. This is pretty self-explanatory. This is what they did and how they did it. All the chemicals and reagents, all the instruments and machines they use, that's all going to be here. Now, it won't include like step-by-step protocols of all the experiments, but what it should provide is enough information that the reader can go and replicate these experiments on their own. And this section will describe the experiments, but it won't necessarily discuss them. So then you will come to results, and it really depends, but some journals will allow you to combine the results and the discussion sections together. But if it's just a results section by itself, this is where they're going to share their findings without any interpretation. This is just what happened. And this section is going to include things like charts and graphs and images and those kinds of things. Now the discussion, this is where interpretation is going to happen. This is where the researchers talk about variables and their relationships with each other. And basically, they're going to explain their observations. And this section should also tie back to the background information. They should be using the background information as context when they're interpreting their results. So that should be reflected here. And there should also be citations because, again, they're referencing other people's work here. So to avoid plagiarism, they should be citing their sources. So then you have the conclusion, wrapping everything up. And this section does a couple of really important things. One, it summarizes the significance of the findings. So here, they're going to make an argument based on their evidence that these findings have some sort of importance. The other main purpose of this section is to talk about future directions. So what other research can be done based on the findings we're talking about here in this article? And then, of course, you're going to have references so you can avoid plagiarism. The textbook also gives a mnemonic to help you remember the main parts of a paper. IMRAD, Introduction, Materials and Methods, Results, and Discussion. This mnemonic obviously doesn't include the abstract, so you're definitely going to want to remember that the abstract comes first. So maybe AIMRAD, I don't know, that might make it a little easier, but IMRAD is fine as long as it helps you remember these are the major components of a research article. And then finally, the textbook talks about another type of article. It talks about review articles. And review articles don't follow the IMRAD format, and that's because they're not presenting original research. Review articles are a review. They summarize and comment on research that's being done in a specific topic. So here I've included a review article about antibiotic resistance. This article is going to summarize and comment on what the scientific community currently knows about antibiotic resistance based on scientific research. So that's section 1.1, the science of biology. If you found this lecture helpful, feel free to click like or even subscribe if you want to. If you have any questions or you need clarification, use the comments. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.